So we have an incredible panel today of folks. Jason Calder from Safer World, Bridget Moix from Peace Direct, Jenny Marin from Interaction, Theo Sittler, who is a senior fellow at AFP and works also as a long-term consultant with us, and Errol Jacob from CSIS. And these are my colleagues have been working very closely with us on these issues. As you know, AFP put out a transition document for the Biden administration. And we went through it. It's over 20 pages. We're not going to have the time to touch absolutely everything in there. And we're not going to be able to do sort of the usual. We're like, well, what was the success? And then what were the challenges? Because when we were talking about it the other day, there's a lot of yes, but there's a lot of qualifying. So you're going to hear a lot of that as well. So it's not going to be sort of your traditional, what are the successes? What are the challenges? And we also want this to be a conversation. So it's not going to be a panel session. There's going to be a conversation that we're all going to have. And if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. So really, we're going to start off with some of the three key pieces that have been said in many of the hearing confirmations, the testimony, that really revolve around the three C's: climate, conflict, COVID. So I'm going to start there, and I'm actually going to turn to Jason and ask, what have we seen with COVID? We know in the past administration, there was a strategy that said there was 4 pillars. One was US interests. The second pillar was health. The third pillar was humanitarian. And in the fourth pillar, everything else got thrown into it. Conflict prevention, livelihoods, I mean, you name it, it was in there. And really the only thing that got worked on really focused on economic issues. So, and we know there's been this big funding that has come through, and USAID and state need to allocate it. So, Jason and anyone else who wants to jump in, what has happened in the last 100 days? What's kind of the shift we've seen around COVID, if anything, and what do we want to see?
Sure, happy to jump in on this. Well, I mean, obviously, there's interesting kind of split screen here. The president has made, COVID the top domestic priority of his administration, and really ramped up vaccines here in the United States. But relatively speaking, has been, somewhat caught flat-footed internationally, in the sense that if you look at the degree to which the administration has got behind COVAX and made that a top priority, it's not there. That's somewhat understandable. Politics is domestic after all. But I think in terms of global leadership on this thing, we may be wanting a little bit more, and I think we may be seeing a little bit more soon. I think also in terms of the basket you mentioned of everything else that conflict was put in, I think it's a real underappreciation with the past administration of the role of conflict in driving COVID and driving insecurity and conflict, and a number of the other things that President Biden made a priority, like pushing back against rising authoritarianism, supporting democracy and human rights defenders, and the potential spillover effects and impacts on our national security of COVID are significant, and we're starting to see it in a number of different contexts. And I think a clear vision statement is still what we're looking for on this, and the kind of action we'd want to see.
Okay, so does anybody want to jump in? I mean, we've had all these sort of dire predictions about COVID and how it has it's stabilization in reverse, is I think what I've coined it. But backsliding a democracy. We've seen so much impact. And we've even seen it here in the United States. Our own, it had a major destabilizing impact in the United States. So what does that do for fragile states? So have we seen that now enough? And what should we be really pushing for?
I'll jump in, and I think Errol, you were maybe unmuting too. So please follow me if you have more to add. I was just going to build off of some of what Jason was saying, and first sort of remind us of the fundamental sea change we have in this administration's approach to COVID. It's hard to actually remember how chaotic and non-science-based it was, if I can use mild terms, and to really sort of realize, okay, we actually have an administration that is rejoined the WHO, that is, taking this both as a domestic and a global health crisis seriously and trying to find a way out. I think what I do think is still lacking is a real clear sense of how this administration is going to tackle the global inequalities around COVID. So, it's quite hopeful when you're here in the US and you're looking at all your friends and family starting to get vaccinated, or many people getting vaccinated, and we're still trying to figure out, how do you get the rest of the country vaccinated and deal with the hesitation of some communities. But we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. When I talk to partners in Africa and Asia and Latin America, I mean, look at India, they're looking at years still of trying to get out of this. And so I don't think I've seen from the administration a really clear enough vision, as Jason was saying, and plan and strategy for how are we going to help lead and, dealing with that massive inequality and this massive gap that we have, which is affecting, how governments are responding and treating their people, which is going to leave a lot of space open still for abuse and rising authoritarianism. And so I think we're still waiting for some of that, level of leadership.
Because it's not just a health crisis. There is a health crisis component of it, but it's not just a health crisis, and how that gets integrated into all programs, even health programs, conflict prevention. Errol?
Yeah, first.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jenny. Jenny or Errol?
No, Jenny was first.
Okay.
Sorry, Liz, you said you wanted this to be a conversation, and I just diving right in.
You go for it.
I just really wanted to pick up on what you were just saying of it's not just a health crisis, and tie it to the governance components, as Bridget also just did. I think one of the things we are watching really closely is where are those funds from the American Rescue Plan going? There is not a strategy out there yet, I think, because they're grappling with a lot of there's a lot of brokenness to deal with here, right? And they're grappling with it. But I think two things that tie very closely to the democracy and governance component are the vaccine equity, like the way that, as Bridget just said, how are we dealing with the global inequality? How are vaccines getting shared? How are we increasing it? But then also, how is it distributed? And the way that will be done within states very much matters, both from a governance perspective and for potential stabilization and destabilizing effects. And then also, I think this administration has done a great job on focusing on the health security, putting COVID in a health security lens, but maybe an over focus on health security, and we're missing the conversation on health system strengthening. And again, there's a huge component of public health that is governance. And by overly securitizing everything in this current health conversation, I think we really risk missing some of those pieces.
Now, that's an excellent point. And I just want to say your point and Bridget's point that we've had a sea change in terms of administration. but what they inherited, and I said at one time on a call that what was happening in the world was like a dumpster fire, including the US. And then someone said to me, that's mean to dumpster fires, somebody from the US government, I won't say who they were, because dumpster fires are stable. And so I think that, there's so much going on, COVID, the economy. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on about all the things, and nothing feels stable right now. So Errol?
There's an excellent GIF, Liz, of a dumpster fire that, like, it's a fire in a dumpster that is being taken down the road by a flood.
Yeah.
And so I think that sort of gets to where you're. I'm also, Jason, what is behind you? Jason, what is this sort of flow document with things behind you? I'm fascinated by this.
That's our process of change. Come over sometime and we'll lay it out for you.
That's excellent. Well, so I think I just wanted to build on what Bridget and Jenny were saying, especially about, I think that from a words and initial personnel perspective, I think the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration, it's hard to envision in the spaces that we care about them being a whole lot better from the kind of signaling and personnel perspectives. I think what international partners, multilateral, bilateral partners are waiting for is a little bit of the kind of oomph behind those words and policy. Color me cautiously optimistic. I think that, as we would say in DC, personnel is policy, and I think the policies will follow. One thing on the COVID thing that I just wanted to emphasize a little bit is this is not just about re-engaging in the multilateral space on vaccines. It's not just about kind of re-engaging on health security. It's about how are we going to use the tools of our bilateral assistance to, COVAX is going to provide vaccines for a certain percentage of people, but that it's not going to get us to where we need to be. And so how do we marshal the really unparalleled sort of leading bilateral assistance that we have? How are we going to reorient that super tanker to address some of the constraints that we are already seeing, for example, in global supply chains on vaccines? And I think as it relates to fragility, I think it was Jenny made this point about the equal distribution or equitable distribution when it gets to countries is really critical, right? Because if we think about what moves conflict into violent conflict, it's perceptions and realities of people being slighted or elites kind of having an extractive approach to governance or something. And people have been in lockdown for a year. They've been kind of, their lives and their economies have been negatively affected by this. And if they see that the first people that are starting to come out of this and going on holiday in Dubai are the elites, that's a recipe. For those of us who think about violent conflict and violent conflict prevention, that's a recipe for future conflict, quite frankly. And I think that as the Biden-Harris administration looks to the future, I think it's worth, it's not just, like Jenny said, it's not just a health security conversation. It's a, violence prevention conversation as well, as human rights and a global health and all that stuff.
Right. And the last funding under the past administration went mostly to health, went to health programs, and they just got plussed up to, start adapting. So you also made, I think, a really good point sort of was brought up, is that the countries that also did well that we're seeing now in terms of the trends have a high social cohesion factor. So it tells us we need to make sure that we are programming also in the United States on social cohesion, because that's where countries did the best, when they didn't politicize it. And Dr. Tedros, who's head of the WHO, wrote an excellent article this past week. I urge everyone to take a look at it, that really drills down into the morality right now. Even I know so many people in the US are like, let's have a meeting, let's get back to normal, let's have convenings. And you're like, what message does that send also? Because, and in theory, we're not going to meet herd immunity either here in the US. Okay, so anything else about COVID before we change to climate?
So Liz, I mean, if I
Yeah.
may
Oh, sorry,
just jump
Theo.
in. I mean, no, that's fine. I mean, just to put a finer point on it, I mean, you mentioned this in your introduction, is that, I mean, if the US isn't focused on getting the rest of the world up and healthy and vaccinated, and as new COVID variants come out, it's going to affect us here at home,
That's
right?
right.
I mean, that's been made even more clear than ever before over the past year, is that our domestic security here and the instability factor that COVID has played here at home, it's just going to keep playing out years to come if we're not, focused on getting the rest of the world up and healthy, providing vaccines, et cetera. So just wanted to mention that point, is that, I mean, we're all tied in this together, and so yeah, we got to figure out a way to move forward. It's not just the U.S. getting to herd immunity.
Yeah, Jenny just put it in the chat, and I've been saying this as well. No one is safe until everyone is safe. So I think that should be our mantra.
And I think this.
Yeah.
Sorry, Liz. I think just one last point on this. I think the fact that we are responding to what is just a terrifying situation in India, and tragic situation. I think that the fact that we're responding and we mobilized is great. I also think that as we start to come out of this ourselves, we need to start thinking about getting ahead and trying to prevent the next Indias. And I think
the next pandemic.
Well,
I mean, this is my husband, who's an epidemiologist, says it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, right? So, right. Yeah. Yeah,
I just think like we're really good at responding. And not to say that, U.S. assistance is going to be what gets India out of this, but at least we sort of acknowledge that there's this big challenge. But I think that we also, the Biden-Harris administration probably is and should be thinking about what the next Indias are going to be. And as we think about deploying our resources, take that into account.
Okay, so before we go to climate, I'm actually going to switch and go to conflict. And you brought up India, which is a perfect point. And what we're seeing is this massive backsliding of democratic principles. I was talking to somebody last week from in India, and they were saying, Facebook is also shutting down that's anything anti-government. You're just seeing this, people are scared if they speak out. There's this big summit, the Democracy Summit, that President Biden has talked about having. What do we do on this backsliding of democracy, even also in the United States, because The Economist calls us a flawed democracy, which I think is kind of generous. So what do we think about this and the conflict pieces of it?
Jason, we're all waiting on you because you're off mute.
Well, so yeah, actually, I was going to jump in on something else earlier, but I'll bring that back in. I think there's a real opportunity with the new administration, and to think about the last in 2021 here, where we've got the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which completely reshaped sort of the global map and U.S. national security and foreign policy, and a whole wave of interventions and conflicts that came out of the international response to those events. And what we are hopeful of from this administration, given the rhetoric, is talk of ending endless wars and having learned lessons, from the last 20 years. But the question is, what does that really mean for beyond just withdrawing troops from specific theaters? Because a lot of policy, a lot of policy since 9/11 has been part of driving authoritarianism. I mean, if you look at the spread of extremist groups, if you look at sort of our counterterrorism policies, have actually destabilized and inflamed conflicts and have triggered authoritarian responses in a number of places, and where we've come in, obviously. So we know the malady, if you will, and we know the connections to this question of conflict and rising authoritarianism. But I'm really interested in seeing, from the CT review that's happening within the administration, the force posture review, new national security strategy. These are all opportunities, with the anniversary coming up this year, for the administration to make some bold statements about how we change course and what lessons we've learned. And I think that's something that our community, these next 100 days are going to be critical in that respect.
Okay, so there's so much to pull through. So so we're talking about conflict, violent extremism, and let's start back with the democracy backsliding and this democracy summit. And what do we want to see? What are some of our recommendations? I know, Jenny, you've been working a lot on that. And then the violent extremism aspect. And Theo, I want you to also be jumping in here on the US, because President Biden has very much said you cannot separate domestic politics from foreign policy. We can't anymore say, do something differently at home, do something differently overseas. So let's talk about that and the conflict piece of it, and some of the things that we're focusing on here in the US and the Democracy Summit. And then, how about implement the GFA? That's a start.
Yeah, Liz, can I just jump in? Because I think some of what Jason said and what you're saying now, and there's a question actually that's come in from the audience as well. It's really interesting about, can you actually address the divide between global North and South and some of these big issues, build resilience with the current system that we have, or do you need a whole new global regime? And I think it's a really good question for the US, for our own domestic situation, and for globally. And it's one of my biggest concerns with the administration so far, is that I think, we have had a racial reckoning in this country, and an ongoing racial reckoning that has exposed US exceptionalism in foreign policy and systemic racism in our own country and in how we engage with the world. And the Biden administration is very good at naming that, and it's saying we are going to address that across all our policies. I think we're still waiting to see some concrete actions, both domestically and internationally, that I think we need to deal with, like a Truth Commission in the US that's been proposed by Representative Lee and Senator Corker and other things that could have been moved on faster, I think, in this first
Senator Booker.
Yeah, Booker, sorry, what did I say? Corker?
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. Booker, Cory Booker. But I think that there's a fundamental question through this whole crisis over the last year. We have said, we don't want to go back, right? We don't want to just go back to what was. We've seen that it's flawed in a lot of fundamental ways here and abroad. And we want to transform, as you said. We want the next version. And my concern with the administration is that it's such a wealth of incredibly experienced people who bring in, exactly some of the perspectives we want, but it's also the old guard in a way of, former administration folks who had a particular view on the world, who still thought, hey, we can be the greatest force of, for good in the world, without necessarily taking on that real issue around how do we do that in a different way and that recognizes and deals with our own conflicts at home if we're going to be a legitimate actor in foreign policy in things like addressing democracy abroad? Because I don't think we can do that if we don't deal with our situation at home.
No, that's right. And Theo and I have been working on this. The Alliance for Peacebuilding has called for a democracy fund based on, the NED overseas. We need our own democracy fund here and programming, to rebuild our democracy, based on a lot of the learning that we've seen overseas. But
so
Theo?
if I can just jump in,
yeah.
I mean, like just the experience of the last election and the post-election period, I think a lot of Americans were, perhaps waking up and not feeling like they really understand what our process is. I mean, right? I mean, just going through the certifying the electoral college votes and all of that. But conversations that I was having with friends and family overseas, they were kind of scratching their heads and saying, this does not look like a democracy to us. The US has preached democracy to the rest of the world for all these decades. And what you all are going through does not look like a democracy. And so Bridget's point is that we got a lot of work to do here at home. And thankfully, there are members of Congress, there are folks within the administration who are looking at this issue, but we need a lot more political will. We need a lot more funding to fix our own systems here at home. And if the administration is going to convene a summit of the democracies, I think it starts by acknowledging that we have work to do here at home and acknowledging that on the international stage. So yeah.
I think that you'll see that. I think those are excellent points by Bridget and Theo. I think that you're already seeing this. I think in President Biden's speech in front of Congress, I think it was towards the end, he did talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and it's this idea that democracy is going to have to deliver. And I think that he was talking about it, I think, in the context of COVID, but also perhaps in the context of the racial reckoning that Bridget was talking about. But I do think that, and this gets a little bit to Bridget's old guard comment, I think that, so they've had the administration, getting back to the 100 days thing, Liz, that we're talking about here, I think they've had competing they've had competing things going on as they've tried to figure out who the people are, right? There's lots of skeletons in the closet from the previous administration. The world is different than it was certainly in 2009, but definitely, certainly since 2016, but absolutely since 2009. And so I think they're trying to figure out how to get the government up and running again, and they seem to have prioritized that, which I think is good. However, I think those people also, they weren't under a rock for the past 4 years. And so I think even if you were in the Obama administration, and all of us here have friends that were in the Obama administration that are now in the Biden-Harris administration, I think they also paid attention over the past 4 years and tried to be a little bit self-reflective, not only on issues of racial justice, but just sort of generally equity. And so I think you're seeing from the president on down this sort of idea that is sinking in that the world is fundamentally different. I think old habits die hard, Bridget. I definitely feel that. And I sort of am, again, cautiously optimistic that they will have, not been under a rock for the past 4 years, figure out they know what the fissures in society are, and they're trying to use their knowledge of the inner workings of the wonkiness of government to actually have a government that's reflective of today.
Right.
Yeah, and
sorry,
listen, this is the most diverse administration we've ever had. I mean, if you look, just for people in America to be able to see themselves reflected at the highest levels of government, that is huge. right? It's huge. So yes, and I appreciate that, Errol. I think, you're right that we are all on this journey, right? We're all going through this. We're all trying to figure this out. I don't know what the answer is. How do you become the country you want to be, right? I think what I would like to see is maybe it's this tension between how do you have a humble foreign policy, right? And how do you sort of recognize the US we have a lot of problems we have to deal with here, and still have leadership on the global stage, which we want. And so I think, watching what comes in the next 100 days, as you were saying, on some of these issues, I think will be really important, and continuing to, hold up that check just to say, how are we making sure we're moving forward? We're not kind of falling back into other patterns, and really grappling with, I think that there is a deeply embedded connection between militarism that Jason was raising, racism, and our own form of colonialism in the US, and this idea of the US exceptionalism, the city on the hill, that we're going to be the great force of good. And I still hear that, and I'm grappling with, what replaces it? What replaces that? Because we can't keep it that same.
I think that's gone, Bridget. I think, most people realize we're not the exceptional, even though I think it still sits in people's psyche. But you brought up DEI, and I don't want to miss the democracy. So Jenny, I'm going back to you, but I want to say the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, that was the point I was going to raise. It's the administration looks like America, and that's phenomenal. At the same time, what it's doing is who's going into the administration, people on our boards, people in leadership, in the folks that are implementing these programs. So AFP's been looking at the numbers. We did in early 2018, we looked at boards, and the number 1 and 2 in organizations, NGOs, AFP partners. And, it didn't look so great. There was a marginal improvement, but that marginal improvement is going to go away because, Bonnie Jenkins, for example, was on our board. She's going to be an undersecretary. Azra Zaya, who was our CEO, is going to be an undersecretary. So, we've lost a lot of that. So we have to address that as well in our own organizations. But I want to go back to this democracy issue. Jenny, I know you've been working on this. What does this democracy summit look like? Like, what do we want? What do we want it to look like? Or what do we want it to do?
It is a great question. And, this was put in the chat already. One piece that's been written about it. Make sure you have a strategy that accompanies the summit. There's been a lot of pieces put out, and honestly, I think it's very much in development. One of the things, and 2 points that have already been made, it's not enough, I think, just for even the United States, but for any country to come and acknowledge where they have problems. What the government is really looking for countries to do is come with commitments, right? And that includes ourselves. And so I think what we can be doing and where we're engaging is primarily on helping to think about, okay, what do meaningful commitments look like? And, from where I sit, we're mostly looking at globally, little less at what the US in particular would bring to the table. But these are commitments that, the US could also live up to, right? But so if you say anti-corruption, or if you're talking about, countering authoritarianism, what practically does it look like at a country level to commit to making progress in that space? And how far can you get before the summit, or really meaningfully commit at the summit, and not just sort of a statement of where you have room to grow, right? And so I think that is one of the key elements where civil society should be engaging with the Democracy Summit as it comes together, because I think it is very much still in development, both thinking about what those commitments are and about the role of civil society in helping to inform those commitments and provide accountability towards those commitments. And, I think, there is a recognition that it's not just a one-day meeting. Summits are great, right? But it's the work that goes into them. It's the process that leads you to them, and it's what follows up afterward that really makes the difference. And I think it can be really powerful if it's done well. And there's a lot of really encouraging early signs and signals. And something to pick up on something that Errol said, they inherited a really broken system, right? At all levels, policy making levels hollowed out, as everybody's read, lots of different things, right? And then we also keep coming. I also share this kind of cautious optimism. We see a lot of good signals. We saw a lot of good personnel. Like if you're thinking about democracy as an issue, democracy, rights, and governance has never been so represented within the NSC, right? There's a whole directorate. There are like 7 people full time working on this. We haven't seen that before. That's a great signal, right? But they have a lot of rebuilding work to do. And I am very cognizant that we keep coming as it was like, yes, this is good. And next. And I think that is both our role, but also realizing it's only been 100 days, much more to come.
Liz, I want to just jump back in on this thing. As organizations interested in conflict and peace building, when you ask what is it that we want to see out of the democracy summit, you can address the issue as democracy and good governance, but I think we should want to see a definite piece on the role of conflict and fragility and the counterterror response and the US's own record. Our democracy deficit is not just how it's practiced here at home. The rule of law deficit, if you will, has shown up in the way that we've prosecuted the global war on terror as well. I mean, we have not been willing to live within the confines of the international rule of law on some of these things. And so I think there's credibility questions on both sides, but making sure we do put conflict and securitized responses as part of the conversation around what's happening with rising authoritarianism, I think is going to be critical. And then getting the voices of the people we work with in countries and bring that to bear, because they have, as we all know, they have some of the best perspectives and can cut through our notions of exceptionalism quite easily from where they sit.
No, that's very true. Errol?
Yeah, just a quick addition to what Jenny said about kind of the White House, and others have talked about it reflecting America too. And I think one thing that they have done in the first 100 days, and quite frankly, this started with the transition, was they've integrated the domestic and foreign policy efforts at the White House in ways that I don't know has ever happened. I mean, I think Ambassador Rice and Jake Sullivan are obviously, in touch with one another often, and just the sheer appointment of Susan Rice to be the head of the Domestic Policy Council is a really big signal that they are seeing these things as two sides of the same coin.
But
no,
you know what? Let's have a reality check. I mean, look at the degree of division in our country politically around the question of the events of January 6th, the nature of authoritarianism and anti-democratic tendencies in this country. It's, President Biden said, I think so well, we want a future in which the, power of our example, we lead with the power of example, not the example of our power. Well, the kind of reconciliation we're talking about needing to have, and the kind of reckoning we're talking about needing to have in the United States, is there really do we, within the body politic in the US, do we have a common definition of a problem or a common starting point? I think that's going to be extremely, extremely challenging. So I think we can't, we can't overlook just how much is going to have to be done on the domestic front, in order to give credibility to what the administration wants to do internationally around democracy.
I think that's a great point. And it also ties to something else I wanted to bring in, which we haven't really mentioned Congress yet. They get a vote too on a big vote on what we do in our foreign policy. and domestically, obviously. And I don't think there's that common definition. And if we're talking about wanting to see sustainable change, both domestically and in how we carry out our foreign policy, Congress has to be part of that conversation. It's in the appropriations, it's in the authorizations. And I think we really don't have a common definition. And there's actually a real risk. We've had a pretty good bipartisan consensus on the importance of foreign assistance, on the importance of democracy engagement worldwide. And if there's a risk in tying it too closely to domestic issues that are seen as very partisan, and that we could actually fracture something that is really important to our ability to engage in the world.
Jenny, that is such an excellent point, because we have had a bipartisan on foreign assistance. Senator Lindsey Graham, Senator Rubio, Representative McCall. I mean, these have been huge champions. And I'm going back to the GFA. You guys skirted around it, but the Global Fragility Act is a perfect example of bipartisan. I mean, it was a bipartisan bill. How do we, because one of the things we're also talking about in terms of how do we address it, we're talking, technical issues and political issues, but a lot of it comes down to operations. Somebody recently in the US government said to me, our procurement system is based on procuring Jeeps in like the 1950s. And so what do we do about that? I mean, that fits into the whole issue of locally led as well in terms of financing. So how do we look at some of the tools that are there, the Global Fragility Act, the Women, Peace and Security Act? How do we implement those? How do we make sure they're not, treated as legacy and actually implemented?
So, I mean, I think the most important piece of the GFA is part of what's getting lost in the implementation, as I understand it, which is that locally led piece, Liz, which I know, we worked really hard, AFP and others to get that in, certainly Peace Direct. That was our primary interest. And I think there was a question in the chat box, what does a reimagined US foreign assistance look like? And I think this relates to the role that the US plays in the world and how we reposition the role of the US. And I think there's a lot that can still be done operationally with procurement processes and with diplomacy, with how we engage around really putting support behind local communities who are on the front lines of conflict, who are facing and dealing with these issues every day, and really putting the trust and the decision-making in their hands, and then backing it up with resources and doing it flexibly and doing it long-term and doing it in much more innovative and creative ways that can be sustainable than our current aid system. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done. If you look, and there's parallels in the US, right? If you look at what's happening right now about putting the trust and the resources to local doctors, local physicians in communities where the vaccine's not being taken up, saying those are the people, those local people will know their communities, they know what's needed, they have the relationships of trust with those communities to help them take the next step towards positive change. It's the same principle with foreign assistance, right? It's really putting that trust and the resources in the hands of local communities who understand peace building, who are doing the courageous work on the front lines. And so how can we reimagine that as our foreign assistance in the future? And it's the GFA, that's part of the GFA, is that the local community should be involved, but it's becoming just a bureaucratic check the box, here's another thing that we've got to implement or coordinate. And so I think that is the kind of shift that I would like to see.
Right, it means we'd have to accept risk. And that's a really big piece of it. Anybody, on the GFA, how do we and WPS, how do we make sure, because all of these, they're fantastic, but if they're not implemented, then they're just words on a paper. So, moving forward, how do we make sure that these, these laws and policies get implemented?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the GFA. A quick teaser for the audience, we at CSIS are producing a policy brief called A Policymaker's Guide to the Global Fragility Act that's coming out later this week. So stay tuned for that. But I think in doing our research for this, we not only wanted to frame this in ways that people that are not wonky DC insiders would understand, we also wanted to dip our toes in that wonkosphere and see what some of the more systemic problems of implementing this GFA are. And there's a couple that jumped out. You've mentioned a couple, but the first one is that actually Congress's job is not done. I think there's this kind of idea that this really seminal bipartisan piece of legislation passed during an otherwise very rancorous, divisive time and was kind of slipped in for signature by then President Trump. And I think that deserves a lot of, the people that did that deserve a lot of credit, but also in the budget as it currently exists, there's no money allocated to the accounts that were set up in the legislation. And so, it's sort of become a de facto unfunded mandate, to use an early 2000s term. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that and you mentioned Women, Peace and Security, WPS. I think the idea, Liz, is that this should be the strategy to how we approach the US government's involvement in places that are experiencing fragility, not another strategy that, imagine a bookshelf and you've got youth peace and security and women peace and security and CT strategy and whatever. It's sort of like, what's the US government's approach in places that are experiencing fragility? And the global fragility strategy is meant to be the strategy of strategies. Now we're getting I'm sure we lost 5 people from this live stream now that I've mentioned strategy of strategies. But I think it's really important. The last thing I'll say on this, and there's much more in the brief, but getting to your point, Liz, on the sort of procurement reform, I mean, we'll lose another 5 people from the live stream if we get deep into procurement reform. But these are things that matter so much. Staffing, how contracts are sort of implemented. You can't implement a localization agenda of the Global Fragility Act in a particular country with the way that the current US government does sort of allocates money. It's not really possible. We've tried it, USAID Forward a decade ago and other efforts. And so I think what the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to do in the next, not just 100 days, but next probably couple of years, especially gearing up towards the next report to Congress on the Global Fragility Act, is they're gonna have to figure out what some of those more systemic issues are and which ones will require Congress, which ones they can do on their own, just with sort of, politically enlightened political appointees supported by great bureaucrats, and which ones are going to have to be punted a little bit down the line. I'd like to believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, but there will have to be some sort of prioritization. Even in the document that we're putting out, there's sort of lots of challenges that are ahead of us, and I think that needs to be tackled in, what are the sort of ones that we can do in the near term that will have the most impact on our ability to execute the rest of this.
Okay, so before we leave conflict, I want to bring in 2 points. One is genocide. We know Samantha Powers, that is, that's her specialty. That's her area that we know she really focuses in on. Okay, so genocide, I want to see how that factors in to the GFA and even in our work in general. We kind of feel like they're 2 side tracks. And then also integration, because one of the biggest pieces of the GFA is integration of conflict prevention throughout, our strategy in a country. And I say this all the time that, you look at the US strategy in a specific country and, it's very focused, let's say, on education and health, no conflict lens there. and the conflict programs, are teeny tiny. So it's also about how do you integrate that. So, we've been having a lot of these discussions. I know, Jenny, we've had a lot of these discussions. How do we promote the triple nexus, whatever you call it? How do we make sure we do it?
Can I just complicate that question, Liz? Because I think the elephant in the room with the GFA, strategy of strategies, or with the triple nexus is the military budget and the continued reliance and sort of, oh, well, we've got to coordinate all this civilian side of stuff much better. Well, actually, the point of the GFA is the civilians are in charge, the military is supposed to be part of that, but that's not how our foreign policy functions, and it's not how the budgeting functions. And so, and Theo, I think, can speak to this much better than I can, but I think grappling with that imbalance, and I've seen the Biden administration not take on the military budget really the way that I would like to see it. That to me is like the fundamental, we have to address that before we can solve the triple nexus on the civilian side.
Well, I do believe we can do both at the same time. But how do we do it in a way, because, our field has turned conflict sensitivity into a PhD. We've made it really difficult. We always beat up on all the other sectors and tell them how they messed up and how they caused a conflict. So how do we do that?
Liz, you're asking the hard questions. I mean, I don't think there is an exact how do we do that, right? I think the things that Errol was pointing to about, what is the dominant frame in a country? You can call it a strategy of strategies, but like if you're having a CT conversation and the US government thinks it's a CT conversation, that's different than if they think it's a fragility or a peace building, or it's a different conversation. You're bringing different voices to the table and you're having a different lead, really, frankly, in what you're prioritizing. So I think that also gets a little bit to Bridget, what you're saying, they haven't addressed the budget component, but in terms of thinking about what is the problem we're trying to solve, I do think there is the potential to switch the framing there. And I think, Liz, first of all, let's not say triple nexus. Let's avoid those terms. It just, we either get eye rolls or, people go, oh, right, what is that thing? But there is an integration challenge. And one thing that Liz and I have talked about a lot is, frankly, how do we encourage the US government to be able to give money in a way that prioritizes integration, that forces integration, that makes organizations that might not normally work together need to partner on the problem. Because I think there's too much, I don't want to put it all back on the USG, but the money is siloed, the programs are siloed, the indicators, what you're reporting back is siloed, and they've got to find a way to knit that together. That would help tremendously, I think, on the implementation side as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to plus one what Bridget and Jenny and even Errol said. The question is how you define the problem. And I mean, we take this back. If you're gonna use the Global Fragility Act to define fragility as caused by a counterterrorism problem, as opposed, we know that so much of the reason why we're seeing spreading insurgencies and everything else are due a lot to internal governance challenges. And this is where the democracy and governance question comes in. And the Global Fragility Act really needs to be an opportunity to look more objectively at the causes of fragility, which sure, extremism and violent armed groups are a part of that, but state behavior and predatory elites and corruption and all of these other things, and even where our own security partnerships and arms sales might contribute to that, are part of the problem. And the Fragility Act needs a real honest kind of come to Jesus moment, I'm afraid, in terms of how we are looking at the world and who we're listening to and what perspectives we privilege when it comes to fragility and conflict. And I hope we see it, but that's why I think the reviews that are underway right now within the administration that are going to be happening over the next 100 days are really going to be critical to these questions, because they're not easy. Threat and insecurity has been part baked into the cake for the last 20 years in terms of our conversations about national security and foreign policy, and moving away from that's going to take real enlightened leadership and a presentation of a vision of what the threats we are facing. I mean, they're at the point now where we've had 200 times more people killed in the United States from COVID than on 9/11. And there just has to be a reassessment of what the threats are and how we deal with them. And it's going to come down in a lot of ways, in the way we implement, under the Global Fragility Act.
So Jason, I love what you said, and I don't even know if you meant it that way, but I'm going to pull it out. Looking at the root causes, and that is the Global Fragility Act, right? It's to say, let's look at what's driving conflict in this country. But I think what you also said was, let's, as I tell my teenage daughters, look inside yourself and reflect on your behavior. I mean, that's actually what we're saying, right? Like, look inside ourselves and see what we've done to promote this conflict as well. So I don't know if you meant to make that point, but that's what I got out of it. On the GFA and any other sort of the conflict piece, how do we, it's sort of been sitting on the side, and how do we make sure we integrate it and integrate some of these tools that we have? But I also want to bring in the genocide piece. One thing that I know people have asked is, do we incorporate genocide into the GFA? What does that look like? I know, Theo, you've worked on this a lot in the past. So what would that look like?
I mean, Liz, my 2 cents to that is to Earl's, previous point about it's part of conflict. Genocide and atrocities happen within the context of conflict, and within the context of bad governance, governments taking repressive actions and so forth. It's part of GFA in that it's the whole of U.S. government strategy of addressing conflict and instability in the world. I think a lot of the work that I've done in the past had to do with preventing mass atrocities and genocide. And one of the things that we would often say is that once the killing starts, the tools that we have at our disposal are fairly limited, right? And I think that's where legislation like the GFA is vitally important to ensure that prevention really takes place, so that we're not at a Myanmar, right, where a brand new administration comes into office and then kind of I was going to say shit hits the fan in Myanmar, right? I mean, it's just and we're kind of grappling with how to respond, what the Biden administration's policy should be, given that everything that didn't happen before the killing started, right? And I think that's where that integration is really, really key, in that we have to have a whole of government strategy to address conflict, to address instability and fragility, and that includes funding, that includes having a real heart-to-heart with Congress about rebalancing where our funding priorities lie, and the administration being able to put forth a vision of what that should look like. I think
you made an excellent point. Once a genocide starts, and even a war, our tools are fairly limited. So we have to focus on that prevention piece. So I think that's a truly, that's a great point. Anybody else want to jump in here, Errol? Yeah,
no. So this is what Jason said and what Theo said and what everybody said is I think gets to the heart of why the GFA is such an opportunity. Now, getting back to the focus of the conversation being on 100 days, remains to be seen how much the Biden-Harris administration doubles down on what we're talking about here as an organizing framework. I know that there are robust discussions happening within government. They're revising the global fragility strategy, and they're thinking about what their target or priority countries are going to be. And I think that's all good. The degree to which they use this as an organizing principle to do things like, oh, by the way, prevent genocide remains to be seen. But here's why this is such an opportunity. If you think about a country, let's say Colombia, over the years, the US has had lots of different equities, lots of different interests in Colombia, but there has been one primary interest that has outweighed all of them, and it's drugs. And there was sort of the fight against FARC and everything. But why does this matter for the GFA? Because if you think about a place that is either sort of starting conflict or on the verge, or dare I say fragile, then there needs to be a way of deconflicting all of the different US things that are going on in the country. And the GFA and the strategies that will come out of the GFA mandated by Congress at the country level, those will provide an organizing framework for the chief of mission, the ambassador, to decide between the competing interests. Because what happens in an embassy and in a mission overseas is like, DC is sending from the Pentagon, DC is sending from the Reagan building, DC is sending from Foggy Bottom, and sometimes those things conflict, right?
Nobody wants to see those people a lot of times out there.
And exactly, but where the rubber hits the road is in the field, and I think the Global Fragility Act and resulting strategies will provide a framework for the ambassador to decide what actually needs to be done to prevent conflict, not is what's in the interest of this siloed, DC administration, but like what's actually in the best interest. And I think that's, if they decide to double down on the GFA, I think that is, to me, one of the biggest opportunities here.
And I think that's a really, sorry, Jenny, that's a really important point in terms of making sure also in these pilot countries, regions, that the country team is bought into it. Because if not, you can't, they can out bureaucrat, the system. And
one way of doing that is not calling them pilot, by the way. Nobody wants to be a pilot country, priority country, or a target
country. Thank you, Earl.
Sorry, Jenny, you had come on.
No, thank you for the priority. And also thank you for always bringing us back to the 100 days. I appreciate that. Jenny?
I just also wanted to note the importance of the terminology we use and the way in which that kind of might get in our way here as well. Like, for example, pilot, yep. But also there is a real challenge, I think, and it depends on where within the US government, but no country wants to be called fragile. No ambassador wants to think they have conflict on their radar or coming and be responsible for the prevention of the conflict. And so sometimes we even have, I think, an internal challenge, or the USG has an internal challenge, and we have a challenge in how we talk about it with them to get through and be on the same page, because there can be, in some cases, a little bit of a no, we can't even put it in that framing. And that, I think, also takes away our ability to then deal with it.
Jenny and I both worked in the US government, and I have like stories and stories and stories of, getting hung up on by, or, walking out into a conflict zone and, people saying, that's not happening here. So it is a huge issue. I also want to say that links into the prevention issue too, putting prevention throughout all of the agency programs, because, health folks or humanitarian folks don't want to say they're working in a conflict zone. And so we come in with our terminology and we take this purist approach, and, they're like, no, we're neutral. We're not working on conflict issues. So I think that's a big part of sort of the language and what we're able to, how we're able to massage that. But clearly no country wants to be called a pilot or fragile. Okay, so we talked about genocide in terms of how it gets integrated. Also, the prevention piece. Can we switch to climate? But before I do that, I want to say one thing. Someone put in the chat, and I couldn't agree with them more. And this goes back to that domestic foreign policy piece. and not bifurcating. We just said that what happened in Armenia in almost 100 years ago or so was a genocide. We should be saying that in our own country here for the things that we did. So it goes back to that whole thing. I mean, looking at what happened with the Native Americans or with slavery, we are not, again, it's like another, we say something for over there, but it's different for here. So I just want to acknowledge that. Somebody put that in the chat, and I think that's great for the domestic foreign policy issue. Can we now switch to climate and how conflict intersects with it and how critical that is? And, yay to the administration, day one, signing back onto Paris, talking about, even going further and instead of 2050, 2030, reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Re-engaging and not being a spoiler, because we also it's not that we didn't do anything, we were actually a spoiler on the climate for the last 4 years. But how do we make sure that we integrate climate and conflict? Who's going to jump in here? All right, Jenny, I'm just going to call on you because we've been having these discussions. And it also impacts the, AFP's membership based is really peace building organization, conflict resolution, interaction. You have the big development organizations, and we are, we switch memberships. We're very closely linked on the climate issue in terms of adaptation, management, mitigation. It can't just all be about the response when a hurricane hits, for example.
That's absolutely right. And obviously it's a huge issue. I mean, I think climate is a really relevant place to not start, but it's a timely place to talk about the integration and really kind of road test how we can practically talk about the integration of these issues together and of the conflict risks, because obviously it is an issue that in these first 100 days, the Biden administration has really taken on full force, right? There's all of the energy and the commitments, the US-based commitments, there's climate summit. You hear when you talk to any agency, they are talking about how they are integrating climate into their programming, into the way that they're doing work. And so I think it's actually really quite timely also when we're talking about conflict and conflict risks to talk about, okay, again, climate is it is a political will challenge. It is a technical challenge. It is a governance challenge. It is the people who are most affected by the crisis had the least to do with creating it. So a lot of what we are talking about and engaging on is how do we make sure that those who are most affected are at the center of the conversation, and that they are driving the conversation around adaptation and mitigation being a big piece. But we're also at Interaction right now talking a lot about the adaptation and recently put out some principles for USAID to consider as they're doing adaptation. And I think that through this conversation is a good place to bring in, again, the conflict risks and the ways that countries are going to make their decisions about what they're going to do for climate change and who is going to be impacted by those, I think does have a material impact on stabilization and conflict risk. And I think we just need to be having tighter conversations between these communities about what are the indicators of progress in the climate space and how do you integrate some of the things you'd be looking for to make sure you're not making conflict risks worse, and vice versa. And as we're doing peace building and conflict prevention programs, okay, how do we need to be thinking about the potential impacts, who's been impacted by climate already, or what might our programs, I mean, we have a whole within Interaction line of work on mainstreaming climate mitigation within our programming, programming that is not climate based, but recognizing that that is a way that we need to do programming now, right? And I think you bring conflict into that conversation too, in the areas in which it applies. So
I just want to point out, I just want to point out, somebody in the chat said we need to move from climate aware working in other countries to climate involved, and recognizing, again, looking to the future, we know we can't, I mean, hopefully we can reduce, so that we don't hit that magic Celsius #1. But what do we do? What do we do to get there?
I saw that Bridget came off of mute with related to the last section, and I was actually really, Bridget, I don't know if you remember what you were going to say, but I was really looking forward to hearing your addition to that.
Just jump in, you know the rules.
Sure, I'll throw in a climate link to it. And Errol, I want to see your brief, and maybe your brief will address this, or you can reassure me. Because my question was about, it was back on the GFA, and it was about the whether the CENTCOMs will go along, like how comprehensive will a GFA strategy really be able to be, given just kind of the realities we're in. And so I was just thinking about the importance of ensuring the CENTCOMs come along, that there is not a separate national security military strategy in a country, that actually, can the GFA really do that? So that's my question for you. And I would love to be reassured that it can, because that, if you could, then you can imagine a reorganization of resources that would be remarkable for how the US could more effectively engage and support positive change in countries, including, of course, the military and climate. I think the military gets climate as an existential threat. At the same time, the military is a huge, climate, producer of climate change. So that was my question.
Yeah, so maybe I'll weave kind of some climate stuff in there too. I think hope springs eternal is, I guess, the first answer. I think the reason that I have hope that that what you mentioned about kind of not just the combatant commands, but just kind of the Pentagon in general, sort of understanding the need to do this, is that they have been supportive in the past. And the people who are leading the Defense Department, from Secretary Austin to Dr. Hicks, #2, to Colin Cowell, #3. I mean, these are people that understand the need to have robust civilian elements. Kath Hicks, used to be at CSIS. She's, wonderful. And during her confirmation hearing, she talked about the need to have robust support to civil society to prevent conflict. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. She said it much more eloquently than that, but I remember tweeting out at the time being like, this is unbelievable, and could really herald something different. So again, hope springs eternal, not just because I'm an optimist, because I think the signals, at least coming out of the Pentagon, are in the right direction.
Yeah,
I've
Errol,
got some stuff on climate, but Liz, sorry.
No, Errol, I was just going to say, you took your optimistic pills this morning.
I did. I did take my optimistic pills. So on the climate stuff, I think the coffee's kicking in now, Liz.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
I think on the climate stuff, I put a link to a short piece that I wrote recently in the lead up to the Leaders Summit on climate, because I basically I think that there needs to be a climate lens across all of our foreign assistance, and I again don't want to turn off readers by saying things like climate lens, but I do think that it's possible, and two of the things that I mentioned are relevant to this conversation. One is, we need not forget about violent conflict, because to me at least, it's no surprise that 2/3 of the most vulnerable to climate change countries in the world, there's 20 countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change, and 12 of them are experiencing violent conflict. And to me, that's not a coincidence. And so I think sort of applying a lens to this is going to be important. And I unpack that in 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs in there. The other is that I think if we think about how the US government should be involved in this, so much effort has been, and I think rightly so, on things like rejoining Paris and sort of rebuilding our bona fides in the international system. I would chalk that up to mostly this sort of decarbonize. Sometimes it's called mitigation, but it's really an effort to decarbonize and kind of bend the curve on climate, which is pretty scary if you talk to climate scientists. And I think that's really important. However, we are seeing, both in terms of violent conflict and other things, we are seeing a need to actually adapt to it as well and help countries, especially those that are experiencing conflict, adapt. And I think that's where the USAIDs of the world can actually make a demonstrable impact now.
Yeah, it's the adaptation, because we're already seeing the impact of climate change. Okay, so I just want to say, someone brought up DoD. One of the things they have said to me is, once the countries or the regions are selected, the priority countries or regions are selected, they will, they'll be able to better engage. And clearly AFRICOM has always been incredibly engaged on these issues. And then also to the security and that how that brings in the security sector. Because just like what you said, Errol, in Colombia with drugs, for example, if we can't reform the security sector side on this, that's how we're also, being part of the conflict as well. So that's a really important step. Okay, I know we're up on time now. I just want to see if anybody has any, we talked about the 3 C's: conflict, climate, and COVID. And looking at what the administration has done and what they need to do more of moving forward. And it also shows how important our advocacy is, or the advocacy community in general. The Biden administration had said very clearly during the campaign what they were going to do on refugees, and then they put a cap on it. And there was a lot of backlash, and they lifted that cap. And so there is a lot of work we can do as a community that we need to keep doing. So that's why this conversation is so important, I think, to take a pause and to see what we need to be focusing in on. But there's a lot we didn't talk about today: Afghanistan, Yemen, going into the country pieces of it. And I know there's going to be other discussions on that moving forward. At the Alliance for Peacebuilding, we have something on Friday on looking at Afghanistan and that decision. Because as we say, Afghanistan WPS implementation is our first test case, really, if we're serious or not, as we pull out our troops. But I just want to give the last word to anybody on the panel. If there's something that we didn't talk about that you really think is critical, I'd like to just give you that opportunity.
Go, Thea.
So Liz, I was just going to add, you can decide whether this is critical or not. Just looking back at the past 100 days.
If you say it, it's critical, Theo. So.
Okay, I decide. Looking back at the past 100 days and the actions that the administration has taken on climate, it's great. It's fantastic. I mean, rejoining the Paris Agreement, the statements that the president has made, like, part of the credit for that, and speaking of advocacy, goes to the movement that's been built over the decades to make that a priority for the president as they come into office, right? And I think that's something that we as a community, particularly in the conflict community, shouldn't take lightly, is that there was real push and real movement behind ensuring that that the Biden campaign and then now the Biden administration makes climate a central priority to the workings of their administration. And I think part of our work ahead is in addressing all of these issues is to build that political will, is to ensure that the American people, I'm sitting here in Texas, where a lot of these issues don't land as well as they I thought they did when I used to live in DC, right? It's different. The way that people listen and hear these issues are different. And I think being able to build movements, being able to convince voters and convince the American citizens that these issues are linked is going to be, I think for us as a community, I see that as one of our biggest challenges ahead, whether it's climate or conflict or COVID, frankly.
So thank you, Theo. That is just excellent. It's about building that political will. And as you were talking, and you and I have been working a lot on US, is that if people at home in the US can actually see conflict and instability, maybe they'll understand what we're talking about overseas more in terms of what needs to get done. But Jenny, I want to bring in your point that was key earlier, which you said, but we need to be really careful how we're linking this domestic and foreign policy, because we do have champions on both sides, on the foreign policy side of it and on the domestic side, on that. But yet on the domestic side, of course, it's politicized, what's happening here in the US. So I think that's kind of tying that all together. Any last points, Bridget?
Yeah, just I think another key piece of this is the role of young people. And I think that none of us on this call are actually the ones who can do the integration and will lead the change as much as the next generation. So, you know, there's the Youth, Peace and Security. We talked about WPS earlier, YPS, Youth, Peace and Security legislation. There may be a domestic effort around that as well. And I think that is really important. We saw, you know, at inauguration, thinking about the 100 days, the start of it, Amanda Gorman blew us all away, right? As positive change agent of a young person. And communities of color, globally or in the US, will also lead this change. And they will see the integration, for good and for ill, between domestic and foreign policy. I think, I think that becomes more apparent and clear in terms of dealing with those things. So the youth agenda, I would call out, and really how do we really mobilize more support for young people as agents of change, YPS. And then also, you know, we've done this consultation with local peace builders around the world on decolonizing peace building and decolonizing aid. And that report will be coming out. And that is also, I think, moving into, you know, really taking on this systemic racism agenda that this administration has called out. I think moves us into thinking about how do we decolonize our policies, foreign and domestic.
So there's a lot of work ahead. We have the YPS Act, the Youth, Peace and Security Act, that many of us are in a coalition focusing on. We have GFA implementation. We have the climate adaptation. We have to making sure that the domestic and the international policies are connected, and that we're also doing the work at home as well, especially on that democracy backsliding. And of course, COVID. How do we make sure that the integration of prevention is throughout the programs as well, which also leads us right back to the GFA as one of its main principles as well. So I just want to say thank you all. Bridget, Theo, Errol, Jenny, and Jason, you guys are not only great colleagues, you're, I know you're all working hard on these issues, as many of those that are here in attendance. And we just want to say thank you so much. And the work continues. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Good to see you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Great chat, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.